It's interesting to think about what motivated me to write this book. And in many ways, it was a timing issue for a very long time ago that made me stop and think about Joan Montgomery and her life. I was a very fortunate person studying overseas as a graduate student in the United States. In fact, Joan had been one of the referees for the many scholarships that I applied for. And while I was living and working in Washington, D.C., I walked through the American History Museum, which is a wonderful museum and public history space. And I was captivated by the exhibition on First Ladies. There were sections on the pomp and ceremony of their clothing and other aspects that were less interesting to me. But there was one aspect in relation to the political lives of First Ladies. And at the time, and this is back in 1992, there was an interesting, absorbing presentation on Eleanor Roosevelt. And it created goosebumps on me listening to her. There was a section which had her radio recordings. She had given a regular address to the nation during the Second World War, and she was speaking about their son being on some ship.
I should like to say just a word to the women in the country tonight. I have a boy at sea on a destroyer. For all I know, he may be on his way to the Pacific. 2 of my children are in coast cities on the Pacific. Many of you all over this country have boys in the services who will now be called upon to go into action. You have friends and families in what has suddenly become a danger zone. You cannot escape anxiety. You cannot escape a clutch of fear at your heart. And yet I hope that the certainty of what we have to meet will make you rise above these fears.
And just at that time, what was then a new book, which was seen as quite a revelatory book on Eleanor, had come out. And on reading it, I found out things that I didn't know, including that she was a distant cousin of Franklin and that her parents had died while she was quite young. And she had been sent by family to a boarding school in England. And that boarding school and the relationship she had with her principal at the time, which transformed her, immediately made me think of Joan Montgomery and PLC. And one of the themes of that book was about how little we know of significant women's lives, Eleanor, of course, being a very public figure. But for all of the girls that had been through PLC, we all had such respect for Joan and her principalship, although we would never have called her Joan, we would have called her Miss Montgomery. We had such respect for her, yet none of us really knew much about her and her life. And it made me think about how important it is to know a little bit more about her, because she had been significant in my life. And then there was one other book that became the catalyst for me actually even thinking about speaking to her about writing her biography. And that was a book by the Australian expatriate Jill Kerr Conway. Jill Kerr Conway had left Australia to go and do graduate studies herself in the US, but had stayed, become president of Smith College, a very famous women's college. And she had, in her academic work, written about women and autobiography, and how few women do write their own stories, and how important it is to capture women's lives and the different ways in which they reflect on their lives. And so that then was part of the process when I returned to Australia from the United States to actually approach Joan and speak to her about writing her book. And what is really interesting is when I first raised the idea with her, her response was very much like the Jill Kerr Conway analysis. She said to me, "But my life is so ordinary," which, as Jill Kerr Conway says, is part of the reason why women don't think about writing their own memoirs or their own stories. But as I talked to her, she slowly came around to meeting with me regularly to write what in her mind at the beginning was the story of the Presbyterian Church's battle for PLC. And she framed her support for what I was doing as an important story to tell about the PLC story, which of course was so ultimately linked to her story.